Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this LSA webinar on journal publishing Demystified, which we are offering as an exclusive LSA membership benefit. My name is David Robinson, and I am the Linguistic Society of America's Director of Membership and Meetings. I'm delighted to welcome our presenters, Andries Coetzee and Megan Crowhurst, the editor and co-editor of the LSA's flagship journal, Language. They'll be sharing some practical advice on how to navigate the publication process based on their experience as authors and editors. Before we get started, though, I'd just like to go over a couple of technical details. First of all, you'll see a handouts box in your GoToWebinar control panel. This contains a copy of the slides you'll be viewing today, and you can download it at any time during the webinar. The file is available in two versions, a PowerPoint and a PDF. You'll also see a questions box in your control panel. During about the last half hour of the webinar, which will be devoted to question and answer, this is how you can ask our panelists questions. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please indicate that as well. Finally, we have just two questions to ask you to help our panelists get a better idea of who their audience is. So I'm just going to start a couple of polls. They'll appear on your screen, and if you can answer them within a minute or so, we will share the answers with everyone. So here goes the first one. It's just asking what your status is. So it looks like almost all of you have voted. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results with everybody. So hopefully you can see this. 61% of you are students, 2% postdocs, 4% non-tenure track faculty, 29% tenure track or tenured faculty, and 4% other. Okay, and then I'm going to the poll, and sorry. So here's the other question. Have you ever submitted a manuscript to a publishing? So that is going out right now. If you can take a moment to answer that. And it looks like most of you have voted. This is so simple, I'm not going to bother to share it, but I will just tell you that almost exactly 2/3 of you have submitted a manuscript, and about 36% of you have not. So that's the poll. We've gotten to know a little bit more about you, and now I'm going to turn the floor over to Andries Coetzee, the editor of Language. He will provide an introduction and an overview of the webinar. So Andries, take it away.
Thank you, David. And let me just make sure my screen is shared. Is my screen shared?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you everybody for joining us today. As David had said, the goal of today's webinar is to demystify the publication process. Publication is still the bread and butter of academia, but it is something that we don't necessarily get taught how to do in graduate school. We get taught how to do research, but not how the publication process works. So we will today talk about the process, run through the different stages, talk about how to approach it. I don't think that Megan and I is going to answer every question or fully demystify the process, but hopefully we will at least, give you some ideas of how it works. So Megan and I will be presenting. So I'm the editor of language. Megan is the co-editor. And both of us have many years of experience in all aspects of the publication process, right? So we've submitted as authors, we've been reviewers, we're both part of the editorial team of language. So I think we've seen the process from all the sides. So a quick overview of what we're going to do in the webinar. So you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subsections of it. I will cover the first 2, and then Megan will take over for the second half of the presentation. So let's then start into it. And the first topic that we'll be talking about then is the pre-submission stage. So this part of the presentation you see has 3 subparts: identifying the appropriate journal to which to submit, how to prepare the manuscript once you've identified the journal, and how to decide whether your manuscript is actually ready to be submitted to a journal. So let's first then talk a bit in more detail about how to identify the appropriate journal. So this is a very important first step to do, because if you submit to a journal that is not appropriate to the research that you're doing, it might result in your paper being rejected. It might cause a lot of work for the editorial team to deal with a paper that may be a very good paper but not appropriate to the journal. So it's really important to do a little bit of legwork before you decide to submit, to identify what is going to be the most appropriate journal for you to submit to. And you see on the screen there's a couple of things that I will briefly discuss. So we'll talk about each of these in a bit more detail. So how does your paper fit into the journal's character? Who's the audience of the journal? What is the journal's efficiency? If things like time to publication matter to you, what is your goal with the paper, and so on. So let's talk about some of these in a bit more detail. So probably the most important question to ask is whether your paper is a good fit for the journal. And even in a field as small as linguistics, there's very many journals, and these journals have different focuses. So some are more theoretically oriented, some are more descriptively oriented, might be focusing more on large amounts of data or description of phenomena. And you have to make sure that your paper fits the identity of the journal in terms of where it falls on this continuum. It's not like certain journals are better because they are theoretically oriented or more data oriented. It's just different journals, and you have to select one that is appropriate to your particular paper that you're working with. Something like the theoretical orientation of the journal might also matter, right? So as you all know, we have very many different approaches to linguistic theory that's practiced by members of the LSA, and some journals are more closely associated with certain theoretical approaches to linguistics than others. So you kind of also have to develop a feeling for which journals are the ones that's more appropriate to your way of doing linguistics. There's also the difference between specialist and generalist journals. So a journal like Language is a generalist journal where we kind of cover the whole field of linguistics. And therefore, something you publish in Language or submit to Language needs to be able to speak to a broader audience. So you might have to write the paper to explain more than what you do if you were to submit it to a more specialist journal, where you might assume that your readers will all be interested in your topic and familiar with the work that you are doing, the theoretical framework in which you're working. So all of these are things you have to think about as you decide on which journal to target. So are you more theoretically oriented in this particular paper? What is your theoretical orientation? Is this a paper that is maybe more appropriate for specialists on a very small technical matter, or is it maybe a broader general paper that makes connections to larger issues in the field? So there are very many different journals with different characters, and you have to find the one that works for you and for your research. So how do you determine what is the character of a journal? Well, most importantly is you have to look at how the journal describes itself, and I'll look at a few examples in a moment to show you how journals do describe themselves. But that's really important because journals have editorial statements, policies in which they describe the kinds of research they publish. And as the editorial team, we take that seriously, and when papers come in, we evaluate them to determine whether they fit how we identify ourselves. And then also you can look at what has been published in the journal to get a feeling for that, talk to people with more experience with the journals, and maybe ask the editor for a question. So here is a few examples of how journals describe themselves. So I have picked a couple of LSA journals because this is an LSA webinar. And this is just a screenshot from Language's own web page. And under the general information about the journal, there is a section on the focus and scope. And if you look at how we describe language, we say, okay, it's the journal of the LSA, and it publishes research articles dealing with linguistic theory, teaching of linguistics, and language policy. So we specifically mention linguistic theory, meaning if you're going to submit something to language, it would have to have a fairly strong theoretical orientation. But we also don't specify anything in here about a specific theoretical orientation. So unlike some other journals, a journal like Language would be open to any kind of theoretical framework in which you might work in linguistics. And then you see we also mentioned teaching of linguistics and language policy. These are two separate online sections only of language that specifically focuses on topics like that. So this gives you an idea of the kind of work that Language might be looking at. On the top of the screen here is another screenshot from the Language webpage. So this is for the phonological analysis section of Language, which is currently an online section of the journal, but it also was just approved by the executive committee to go to become an independent journal of the LSA. So soon it will cease to be a section of Language. But if you look at the statement of phonological analysis, you see what phonological analysis specifically is looking for is high quality scholarship in phonology that is not currently represented in Language, so showing the different focuses. And you see how it's described: deep description and analysis of primary data. So this is a journal that focuses more on data, maybe. In-depth elucidation of assumptions of phonological theories, so very technical, specific to phonology, maybe not as broad an audience as Language. So just gives you an idea of how journals talk about themselves, and you have to, when you have your research in front of you, try to determine what's the character of your research, and then go and look how journals describe themselves to find one that you think is most appropriate to your particular research. So you should also definitely look at what has been published in the journal. So look at titles that have been published over the past, say, 3 to 4 years in the journal. Do they look like your paper? Is it similar topics as what you are discussing in your paper? You can look at the references of your paper. Do you cite papers from the journal to which you're going to submit? So all of these might be indications that you are looking at an appropriate journal. On the other hand, if you don't cite any research that appeared in the particular journal, that might show that your paper has a different focus. It might not be appropriate for this specific journal. And then, of course, the field in which we are all working is a community, and we should use that community. So rely on other people with more experience or different experiences than you have. So talk to your colleagues, talk to your advisors. They might have more experience in general with publications or even with specific journals, and use that resource. So let other people look at your manuscript and think whether it's appropriate. It's important, though, to be careful of anecdotal evidence, right? So all of us at some point, if you're long enough in an academic field, would have had a bad experience with a particular journal. And we know how dangerous it is to generalize from a single experience. So you should also be careful not to be unnecessarily biased by individual experiences that other people have had. You can also, if you're uncertain, approach the editor. This is something, however, that now speaking with about a year's experience as being an editor of a journal, I would suggest you only do if it is really necessary. So the members of the editorial team are typically very busy, and a large amount of our time goes into trying to make the journal run smoothly, and we just cannot possibly evaluate every paper to decide whether it is appropriate for the journal or not. So do your legwork beforehand, and once you've done that, if you are still in doubt, that might be a time to ask the editor carefully for some advice. And the editor might then tell you topic-wise that sounds appropriate to the journal. That, of course, doesn't mean anything about a prediction of the eventual outcome of the review process. The paper would still go through the review process and may or may not succeed. Something else to think about when you are picking a journal is, what is your goals with this particular paper? So sometimes what we need when we are working on publication is fast results. So let's assume you're finishing your PhD and you're about to enter the job market. You might want publications, and you therefore might want some journal that is likely to get to the point of acceptance fast. Or maybe you're coming up for tenure and you need a few more accepted publications. So in that case, you would want to find out, to the extent possible, what is the typical time to decision for the journal. So how long between submission and you getting an answer whether the paper is accepted or not. Some journals make this information available on their websites, so you can look there. Or again, you can ask for people who have had experience with the journal. It's again something you can carefully ask the editor, but sometimes it's very difficult to get that information, and the editor might not have access to it either necessarily. Something that's important to keep separate is the time to decision and the time to publication. So the time to decision is probably more important. So how long does it take from when you've submitted the paper until a decision is rendered that it has been accepted for publication? Because once that has happened, you can put it on your curriculum vitae as in print or accepted, and many journals might even post it online at that point. It might take another 6 months or a year before there's space in an issue of the volume for it to be published, but time to decision is the one that's probably more important if you're looking for building your CV. You might also be less concerned about fast results. You might want to make a specific point with a paper you're writing. So let's imagine that you are writing an important statement paper, and you want to make sure that this paper is widely read. In that case, you might look more at the venue, the specific journal, and you might care less about how long it might take to go through the review process in that journal. So generally fast is better, but sometimes some journals that take a bit longer might be journals with higher impact that's read more broadly, and sometimes that might be the appropriate venue for a specific paper that you're working on. So identifying the appropriate journal is important because that can determine your eventual success or not. If you submit to the wrong journal, it might take 3 or 4 months to get a decision of rejection of not appropriate for the journal, and that's 3 or 4 months that you could have spent waiting on reviews at a journal that's more appropriate to your paper. So do the necessary work to determine whether this journal is appropriate for you or not. Preparing the manuscript, let's quickly talk about that. So it's important to follow the instructions that the journal gives you very, very carefully. So every journal will have instructions about how to prepare a manuscript for submission. What you see on the screen now is again just a little screenshot that we use for language. And what you see at language, we don't ask our authors to submit initial submissions following the style sheet of the journal. So we just want something that is easy to read for reviewers and for the editorial team at the initial submission stage. Once a paper is accepted, we'll ask you to format it according to the style sheet. But other journals might have different requirements. So other journals have very clear guidelines about how even the initial submission must look, and they might ask you to format it according to the style sheet at initial submission. Whatever the journal asks for, it's important to follow it very closely. If you don't, your paper will either be rejected or sent back to you, and you will just slow down the process unnecessarily. So make sure to find the instructions and follow them very carefully. Of course, really important to proofread your paper very carefully before you submit it. You want to find all mistakes in there. You want to make sure your formatting is consistent. This is really important. I cannot tell you how often reviewers and members of the editorial team get annoyed at authors whose work appears sloppy. If we have to correct too many typos or point out inconsistencies in style, it creates an impression of not being careful, and it casts doubt on the overall quality of your research. So really important to proofread and make sure that your manuscript looks as professional as it possibly can. Kind of in the same vein, appearances matter. So you want your paper to look professional. You want the formatting and the style to be consistent throughout. Whatever style you choose, stick to that. You want to make sure that any figures and tables that you use look professional, is easy to interpret. When you are preparing your manuscript, also think about how it might be read. So some reviewers will be reading it online. Others might prefer to print it out. So make sure that it would be easy to read in whichever format a reviewer might want to look at it. You want to make it as easy as possible for the reviewers to up the likelihood that they would like your paper and not get unhappy with the amount of work you make them do. So a quick example of what I mean by appearances matter. So here are two graphs that show exactly the same information. The one on the right-hand side of your screen, I think, communicates the information more clearly. The one on the left-hand side uses just shading. So if you were to print this, you might not see the difference between the bars. There's probably too much information on there, information that's not needed. Abbreviations are used, so a reviewer would need to go back to the text to find out what MS and VOT stand for. So think about the reviewer, making it as easy as possible, and then you want to keep your reviewers as happy as you possibly can. Okay, so we've talked about identifying a journal, about how to prepare the manuscript. So how do you know, once you've done all this work, that your manuscript is now ready for submission? A couple of things to keep in mind. A really good term paper that you write for a seminar in graduate school is not necessarily a good journal article. If you get a high grade on a term paper and the faculty person for whom you've written it tells you it's a great paper, you have to remember that that is being evaluated as something that you can do in roughly the last 4 weeks of the semester. Whereas a journal article is evaluated as something that you have done with virtually no real time limits. So the standard against which really good term papers and really good journal articles are evaluated is quite different. A good term paper is a good first draft of a journal article maybe, but it would require a lot of additional reworking before it's ready as a journal article. And then in the same way, a dissertation also doesn't make a good journal article because they have different goals, right? So in a dissertation, you will have a more extensive literature review than in a journal article because you have to show that you know all of the literature. In a journal article, it might be assumed more that the literature is known and shared between you and your audience. You don't have to show that you have read everything. In a dissertation, you have to show that you can do research. It's kind of your entry ticket to the field. In a journal article, the assumption is you can do research. You don't have to show the audience that. You just have to show the research that you have done. So the purpose and goal of these two documents are different, and things that do not work as journal articles, which we do get sometimes, is a chapter from a dissertation. You have to take it and put it into an article format. The first draft is never a good journal article, so revise, rewrite, get feedback from conferences, have your colleagues read your papers, your advisors, put it aside for a while, come back to it later, see if it still makes sense. Journal articles require a lot of revision even before you submit, and they're typically much more polished writing than anything you might do in a class in grad school. Something to be careful about is the question of whether you should publish your paper somewhere before you submit it to a journal. This can be very helpful because it can be a place to get feedback from other scholars. If you publish in something like a conference proceeding, it might be something that you can add to your CV to start building your CV. But you should be very careful with that and carefully consult the different journals to which you might submit their policies about things like this. Some journals have very strict policies and would not accept submissions even for something that appeared in the conference proceedings. Others is a bit more lenient in that regard, but whatever you do before you submit to a journal, make sure that you've read that journal's policies about pre-publication. So at the bottom of the screen, you have our policy at language, and what you see is, as a general principle, we do not consider for publication something that has appeared in print elsewhere. We make an exception saying if it has been published in, for instance, a conference proceeding, something that maybe wasn't peer-reviewed, we might consider a submission for it at language on the condition that the language submission is an extension of the other work you've done, goes beyond the conference proceeding. And even then, we ask that you contact the editor beforehand, submit a copy of both documents so that we can look at it and make sure they are different enough. So every journal will have some kind of policy about this. Make sure that you consult it before you submit to the journal. If we find after the fact that something has been published previously before submission to the journal, that usually results in the paper just being rejected outright. And you can avoid that by finding out the policies of the journal and following them before you submit. Similar issue is duplicate submissions. It is never acceptable to submit the same manuscript simultaneously to more than one venue. So don't submit the same manuscript to 2 journals or to an edited volume and a journal. It is in violation of the basic ethical standards of scientific publication. If you do this, chances are that you will be caught out, because chances are good that the same reviewers might be reviewing the paper at both venues. And if that is found out, it will undoubtedly result in rejection of the paper at one, if not both, of the venues to which you've submitted it. So just don't do it. It's just not worth it. Okay, so that much for the pre-submission stage. So everything up to now, your paper is ready to be submitted. Let's move on to the second topic, which is you've now created your manuscript, it's ready to be submitted. How does the submission process work? Most journals nowadays use some kind of online submission system. Some journals, especially smaller ones that might have less administrative support, might still work with email attachments. I really don't think that there's still any journals that use hard copy submissions. When I first submitted something to Language 10, 14 years ago, Language was still using hard copy submissions, so I still had to make multiple copies and mail them off to the editorial office. I don't think that happens anymore. There's a lot of benefits of using online systems. They're more reliable, so manuscripts are less likely to disappear or fall through the cracks. It's easier for both the authors and the editorial team to track the progress of a paper through the system, and usually it also results in faster outcomes. So when you submit something, again, as with everything else, look for the instructions that the journal posts and follow them exactly. What file type is required? Do you need one document only, or do images have to be submitted separately? Is a cover letter required, and so on? Whatever the journal requires, make sure you follow that, because if you don't, your paper is likely to be rejected or returned to you, and it makes more work for you, makes more work for the editorial team, and it might make the editorial team not necessarily very happy with you if they have to do the work that you should have done before you submit it. So look up the instructions, make sure you follow them. Some journals require a cover letter. Not all do. Sometimes you have to submit it as a separate document. Sometimes there's a text box that you can enter. These cover letters, if they're required, really doesn't have to be long. It can basically just be, "Dear editor, here's our manuscript. We appreciate you considering it for publication." If it's required, make sure that you submit something like that. A question that we often get is whether authors can or should suggest possible reviewers for their papers. Some journals request this, some do not. I think in general it is acceptable to do so even if a journal doesn't explicitly request it, but it's still something to be careful about, because you want to avoid the impression that you are handpicking reviewers who may be sympathetic to your views. So be careful in selecting and proposing reviewers, and even if you suggest certain reviewers, it's very likely that the editorial team will not select all the reviewers from the list that you have suggested. So somebody that you left off because you didn't want that person to review a paper might anyway be selected because you left that person off. It is sometimes, though rarely, okay to suggest to the editorial team to avoid specific reviewers. It is not acceptable to do that if there is simply somebody with whom you have an intellectual or theoretical disagreement, but sometimes there's more serious background information that would make a particular reviewer not appropriate. In that case, it might be okay to very carefully communicate to the editorial team about possibly avoiding somebody. But it has to be done with great care, because again, you want to avoid the impression that you are just trying to prevent somebody whom you think might not be positively inclined towards your research from being a reviewer. Something else that we struggle a lot with authors is anonymization of manuscripts. So most journals nowadays imply some kind of blind review. In some journals, some journals use a single blind review, which means your identity will be known to the reviewers, but you will not know who the reviewers are. Most journals probably use the double blind review system, which is what we have at Language, meaning authors don't know the reviewers and reviewers don't know the authors. There's more journals nowadays that do open review where everybody knows everybody else, but whatever the specific journal uses to which you're submitting, make sure you know the policy and that you follow it. If the journal uses some kind of blind review system, it's going to require of you to anonymize your manuscript. And then again, you have to look what the journal's policies about that are and follow it. Some journals will require that you don't refer to yourself and you replace references with something like author. Some journals will prefer that you refer to yourself in the third person, and in that way, therefore, not explicitly reveal your identity. Whatever the policy of the journal is, find out what it is and make sure that you follow that. It's also important to not just anonymize the content of your paper, but to remove the metadata from any file that you submit. This is something that many journals forget to do, many authors forget to do, and then reviewers sometimes come back to us, say the paper wasn't really anonymized, and that makes it very difficult from the side of the editorial team. So the screenshot here is showing you, once you have created a PDF of your document, you have to check the metadata. So in Adobe, that's easy to do. So under the file drop-down menu, you can go and look at the properties tab, and then you see what the document properties look like. If I create a PDF on my own computer, I am listed as the author in the meta data for that file. So always find out whether your identity is still somewhere present in the metadata, and if so, delete it so that your manuscript is properly anonymized. I think at this point I have just about finished my part of the presentation. So I've talked you through identifying a journal and then preparing your manuscript and then submitting it to the journal. And now I will hand over to my colleague, Megan Crowhurst, the co-editor of Language, and then she will take you through the rest of the presentation.
Okay. Did that work?
I don't see your screen yet, Megan.
Okay. There, how's that?
Yes, there. I see your screen and your camera, so I think you are ready.
All right, great. Okay, so now we come to talking about what happens after you submit your paper for consideration to the journal. And so there are several aspects of this that we'll go through. First is what happens, what steps happen. So if we start with what happens when the editors receive your paper, this is a sort of a flow chart from Wiley Blackbell as to what happens, what the peer review process is like. So I can't quite see this. I need to move something on my screen. So once you submit your article, the first thing that happens is that the editor receives it and will read it, him or herself. And then at that point, it could be that the article is found to be not a suitable submission for the journal, in which case the paper might be desk rejected at that point. If it does seem to be appropriate as far as the editor is concerned, then it might be sent out to reviewers, or at a journal like Language and other journals nowadays, there might be a team of associate editors, and the article might be assigned first to an associate editor. If it passes muster there, then it will be sent to external reviewers, and who eventually will return reports on the paper. And those reports can say a number of things that we can talk about later in the presentation, but there might be a judgment that the paper needs further revision, in which case the author will might be invited to submit a revised version of the paper, and the cycle will begin again. If you're really lucky, or if this is after a couple of rounds of revision already, then the paper will be accepted. It will go into production, and then eventually it will be published. So this screen generally tells you what, in rough terms, what the process is like, what happens to your paper once you've submitted it. All right. So again, just to go over some of this in a little more detail. So the journal's editor will always assess each submission to decide if it's a suitable submission or not. So desk rejection it means that an unsuitable submission is being declined without external review. So you don't always, if you send your paper to a journal, you are always, have the right to have have it read and some kind of opinion delivered on it, but not necessarily to have it sent out to the external reviewers. At Language, we have a team of associate editors. And if we receive a paper that we think is suitable, or even if we're not completely sure if it's suitable, we'll send it on to an associate editor based on their specialization. And then the associate editor will read the submission as a specialist to assess merit as well, and might also recommend desk rejection in that case. So why do we desk reject papers in this way? Well, for two reasons. It saves everybody's time. It saves you time. You don't want to be waiting for 3 or 4 months to hear that your paper wasn't suitable. So we really do try and get you that decision within a couple of weeks, as soon as possible. And the other thing is that desk rejection conserves reviewer resources. So it's important. That's important as well. So, but the guiding question is not whether the editor likes the paper or not. That's not really the issue. The issue really is the submission likely to survive the external review process? And if the opinion is that it's not likely to survive the external review process, which can take months, then it's generally judged to be better to turn down the paper. So here are reasons why a paper might be desk rejected. One might be thematic incompatibility. The paper might simply be it might not be on the right topics or the right approach. So for example, Language receives a large number of papers on L2 issues, second language research, and we don't publish papers in that area. So we are fairly quickly able to send a letter to authors saying that it's not an appropriate submission for the journal, and we usually try to think of an alternative place they could send it. Another would be failure to conform to guidelines. Another one would be that it might be a very nice paper in some ways, but it could be that the innovative contribution is insufficient, or it could be that the paper doesn't make a theoretical point that's sufficient for publication. Another one might be flaws in methodology or argumentation, expositional issues. The paper just might not be clearly written or organized. It could be that the paper doesn't deliver on what it promised, or it could be that the manuscript is just technically in such bad shape that we wouldn't want to send it out for external review. So this is where making sure that the manuscript is written in grammatical English, that you've checked all of your typos, that things are well organized, no sentence fragments, because even these things that you might think of as not as being quite separate from the intellectual content of your paper, they really do matter. So once the paper is in the hands of the associate editor and we think that the paper is ready, appropriate to send to the external reviewers, the associate editor will invite 2 or 3 to reports from experts in your field, in the field represented by the paper. And those external reviewers determine, again, whether the paper is appropriate for journal, whether the paper's contribution is sufficient for publication. Hopefully, they will provide some high-quality feedback for the author, feedback that indicates that they've engaged positively or in some way with the paper. The report will speak to the paper's strengths and weaknesses, and there will be suggestions for improvement. And the reviewer should also make an explicit recommendation for the editors as to what the decision should be. So the editorial decision, once reviewers have done their job, the external reviewers have done their job, the associate editor, at a journal like Language, the associate editor does this. At a different journal, it might be the editor that does this if there are no associate editors. But for us, the associate editor collects the reports and reads them and produces her own report that summarizes the evaluations of the external reviews and highlights the most important points in her or his opinion, provides a personal assessment of the paper's worth. Remember that the associate editor will often be, an expert in the field represented by the paper as often as possible. And a good associate editor will actually chart a path for the author to follow in revising the paper. And this is particularly important just in case there's conflicting advice in the external reports. Then the associate editor makes an explicit recommendation to the editor, which the editor takes as advisory. So it's not always the case that the decision of the associate editor is the ultimate decision. Sometimes these decisions actually get discussed between the editor and the associate editor, or even between the 2 editors at a journal like Language. A lot goes on behind the scenes when your paper is being considered. So the editorial decision, what does that mean? So so the editor's letter, you'll get at the end of the process, of the review process, you'll receive a letter from the editor, which would include the editorial decision, and it'll include all of the reports that the editor receives, the associate editor reports, and all of the external reports as well. And you may get a deadline for resubmission if you're invited to return the paper, an improved version of the manuscript. The deadline generally varies. So at Language, it's fairly recent, but we now give people a 6-month deadline by which to return the paper to us. And there are a number of reasons for this, but a primary reason is to keep the submission moving forward. If at the journal we want to make sure that we have enough papers and they're moving forward efficiently so that we can see down the road to how we can organize the contents of the journal. And we don't want reviewers to forget about the paper and then not be available when the time comes to look at it again. There are all kinds of reasons for maintaining a deadline. Some journals have much more stringent deadlines. So my experience these days is with the phonetics, the laboratory phonology journals, and a journal like the Journal of Phonetics will give you a 3-month deadline if you were asked to make major revisions, and they'll give you a 2-month deadline if you were asked to do minor revisions. I recently received a decision just a couple of days ago for a different journal, which is giving me until December the 22nd, which is less than a month. So, so these things can vary widely across journals. Some journals don't have a deadline, and people will send their papers back a year or even 2 years later, which is not optimal for a number of reasons. It's really important to keep the decision letter somewhere handy, because it will always include important information about how to resubmit your paper. It will normally tell you all sorts of things that you would want to have at your fingertips when the time comes to resubmit your paper later. So the typical decision categories, you know, the happiest one is accept, your paper's being accepted. This doesn't happen normally on the first round. This is usually after 1 or 2 rounds of revision. Another decision would be some version of minor revisions. At language, that usually comes out as being revisions required, which is a little ambiguous, so we specify what that means in the letter. Another, you know, ubiquitous category is revise and resubmit. A revise and resubmit decision, or some version of that, generally means that the editors believe that a single major revision would be enough to almost bring the paper to publication standard, and then maybe another round of minor tweaks. So then the unhappy decision would be that the paper is being declined. This can even be if a paper has merit. But the editors, it's possible that the editors wouldn't see a clear path to publication, or more than 1 round of major revision would likely be required. So perhaps specific to language, actually, and other journals as well, but certainly at language, our rule of thumb is that if we receive a manuscript and it really looks like more than 1 major restructuring would be required, we decline the paper, although sometimes we might leave the door open for a future submission down the road, where it will be possible for us to see a little more clearly that there's a path to publication. The other reason for a decline decision is simply that the paper doesn't have sufficient merit to invite a resubmission. So the length of the review process, once you submit your paper to the journal, you're in waiting mode, and this can be an anxious place to be. So how long does it take? This is something that really varies across journals, and so it isn't really possible to give a one-size-fits-all answer. At language, we tell people in the message that they receive when they submit that it can take 1 to 6 months for a research article to receive a decision. Our average lately has been at about 4 months or just under. It does sometimes take 6 months. It can even take longer than that in the odd, unusual case. But if a paper is going to be desk rejected at the beginning, if, for example, we're not the optimal place for an author to be submitting the paper, people can receive a decision about that quite quickly, in a week or 2 weeks. Some papers, some journals have about a 4-month turnaround. So I know that the Journal of Phonetics aims to get people a decision within 3 months. So in some cases, a journal like JASA, Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, which has a short format category called express letters, they say that they'll get you a decision in 8 weeks. And so this is a very good place to send a short paper. So when I say short, I mean these are papers that will be 4 pages in print once they're accepted. So if you want a quick publication and you have something that would be suitable, you know, this is something that you could consider. So what are the factors that affect the time to decision? One, I would say that the single most important factor is the number of readers sequentially in the review process. So at a journal like Language, we have the editor who reads everything, some things more carefully than others, in the sense that we have our specializations as well, but we read everything. And then you have associate editors who read the papers. They have their own academic careers as well, so they're fitting their language work around everything else that they need to do. You know, the time spent soliciting external reviews, and then of course the external reviewers need to read the papers as well, and that can take time. One thing that we can definitely say is that the length of the manuscript is a major factor in determining how long the review process takes. We have a length maximum of 18,000 words, which is, I forget how many pages that is, but it's in the 40s. And to be really, a 25-page paper gets through the review process much more quickly than a 50-page paper. So this is a major factor as well. So one thing, so let's say that it's been 4 months and you're on the job market, you're worried about the paper that you sent out, you know, you want to know what's going on. What do you do? Well, the first thing that you should do is check on the status of the paper in the online record for the submission first. So you'll find sometimes that there's not a lot of information there. And in that case, a polite status inquiry may be appropriate. We really don't mind hearing from authors who politely ask us where the paper is in the review process, and we're usually able to give specific information about that. But it's a good idea to make sure that the period of time you were told to expect has already elapsed. So for us, we say in the initial letter, expect a 1 to 6 month review process. 2 months along is too soon to be writing to say, you know, what's going on with my paper. But 4 months is probably okay. I don't personally mind having a request around 4 months, and you know, this seems to be acceptable. So you can do that. All right, so the next thing would be, you know, now we're still in the, I think we're finished with the post-submission stage now, and we're going to the post-mortem stage, okay? The reviews are in, some kind of decision has been made, you've been sent the decision, what now? So the first thing is, you know, what happens if you were rejected? Now what? There's a lot of ego in publishing for us because our ideas tend to define us professionally, and so it can feel really punishing when our intellectual output is rejected. Just be aware, most of us have had our work rejected at some point, and this is a normal part of academic life, and it does not reflect on your personal worth. So this is really the most important thing to remember. It's painful, but get used to it, and it's a normal part of academic life. You can use what you've learned to your advantage. You may not need to abandon the paper. A common thing that people do, this is certainly something I've done, people who are perfectionists might tend to do this, is if you've had a paper abandoned, they don't do anything with it. They let it die. And that might not be necessary to do that. With appropriate, it might be a good paper for a different journal, or with appropriate revision based on the feedback that you've received. You can send that paper, you can often send that paper to a different journal and succeed there. So what do you do with the reviews once you've received them? One thing you could consider is dealing with the reviews in stages. You could consider reading the letter and the reviews over once, then set them aside until you have processed your initial reaction and can read the feedback objectively and as dispassionately as possible. Or even before that, the first stage might be looking at your inbox and seeing that the letter has come in from the editor and letting it sit there for a couple of ideas to get used to the idea of reading it. But when you are ready, read each review in detail, and you can sort the comments that you're getting according to various types of considerations. You can come up with your own categories, but for example, what kinds of things were commented on that would be easy fixes, typos, Did you need to add a definition somewhere? Did you need to make some assumptions more explicit? Those are issues that are easy to fix as opposed to issues that require deeper thought. So for example, if a reviewer thinks you didn't support your argument strongly enough or thought that there was an alternative way of looking at the issue. So the other category then would be, deeper expositional versus more substantive methodological or theoretical issues. Did the reviewers simply not buy your theoretical approach, or did they think that you could have presented your ideas in a clearer way that and could have organized the paper better? So another way that you could think of it would be, were there issues that might have been due to a reader's misunderstanding? Did you need to be clearer? Or are there issues on which there's real disagreement with the reviewers? If there's real disagreement with the reviewers, then that would be something that you would need to think about when you're deciding whether to continue with the paper at that particular journal. So some advice about what not to do when you get the reviews. It's really not a good idea to write an angry defensive letter challenging the negative decision you received yesterday. It's not a bad idea to just take a deep breath, let a few days go by. Don't respond immediately. Please don't insult the objectivity, ethics, or qualifications of the reviewers. Don't criticize the editor's decision and suggest that the editor isn't qualified to evaluate research in your field, etc. Don't imply that there is a conspiracy to suppress your work. Believe me, we receive all of these kinds of things. And it doesn't make the best impression. And even though it's perhaps natural to be angry when we receive a decision that challenges us that has ego associated with it, do consider how an action that you take in a moment of disappointment may reflect on you later. So it might seem tempting to write a letter, even if you wait a while, it might seem tempting to write a letter challenging a negative decision. And it's not always out of the question to do this, but it's a step that should be carefully considered. So just bear in mind that editors and associate editors are always evaluating the quality of the reviews they receive, as well as the quality of the submission. And if the editors believe that a reviewer has been unfair or biased, they take that into account to the extent that they can tell. And if they believe this, then they probably have already considered obtaining an additional review if they felt that they were not themselves able to take that into account and reach a fair decision on their own. So if you honestly believe that a rebuttal is warranted, be prepared to make a convincing, well-supported argument in measured, polite language, and this should probably only rarely, if ever, be done. So, possibly the most common decision, well, I don't know about the most common decision, but a common decision is the paper had merit and you were invited to resubmit it either with major revisions or minor revisions. So the first thing you need to do is decide whether you want to resubmit the paper. So it can be useful to maintain a ranked list of journals that would be appropriate for your work. And my advice is always to be ambitious and submit to the best journal that you can possibly imagine your work getting into if you think the paper is appropriate for that journal. And then if it doesn't get accepted by that journal, strategically move down in your list. So what you need to do, first off, is carefully evaluate the reviews in the editor's letter to decide whether to resubmit to the same journal or whether to submit to your next choice. So the things that you would pay attention to would be the tone of the editor's letter and the reviews. Or is the tone positive and inviting? Was there any evidence that the associate editors and reviewers engaged with your work positively? Did they seem excited about it? Do you think that the revisions requested by the reviewers are fair? And even fair doesn't necessarily mean that unfair doesn't mean they they disagree with you doesn't mean that they're unfair, so that's something you should think about on balance. But even if you think that the reviewers are basically fair, let's say they see the paper in a different way than you do. In that case, are you willing to take the paper in the direction they suggest? You may or you may not be. And that would figure into your decision, factor into your decision. If the amount requested is massive, do you have the time to undertake it? Are you willing to undertake it? So these are all things that you would consider in your decision as to where you'd send the paper. If you decide to submit to a different journal, you can still, and you should use the feedback that you've received to improve the papers in the way that you think you can. So always be aware that scholars review from multiple journals and that you may get the same reviewers again. It's not uncommon for us to have a reviewer tell us that they read the paper for a different journal, And we often get two kinds of responses. One kind of response is that the author did a great job of revising the paper and it's much better now than it was when they saw it previously. But the other kind of response is that the reviewer didn't think that the author had done anything to the paper. And that doesn't generally go down too well with the editors. So we really do, if reviewers spend a great deal of time and energy that they're not paid for to read your work and comment on it, and the editors do expect that that authors will improve their papers when they get useful feedback. So, which is the next point on this slide, is that we do expect that you'll make every reasonable effort to use the reviewer's feedback to improve the paper. But we also expect the scope of the revision to be in keeping with the character of the original submission and the work requested by the reviewers. So there is, we don't want to see too little work that's being done. We want to see responsive revisions, but we also don't want to see a completely different paper for no good reason. If we receive a paper and the character of the paper has, again, and the character of the paper has fundamentally changed, then this puts us in a difficult situation sometimes in regard to how do we treat the paper. Should it, is it really a different paper and should be reviewed again? Or do we treat it as a resubmission of the same paper? So in some cases, you will find that reviewers are asking for a thorough overhaul of the paper, and in that case, that's fine, but be clear about what's being asked. So advice is read the reviews again and again and again. I find it helpful to make checklists, important to be very familiar with what you're being asked to do. So non-responsive revisions in which authors ignore requests for change are generally reviewed negatively, and if the editors feel that you haven't addressed the reviewer's feedback and that this was willful, that can be grounds for rejecting a paper if it's significant enough. But there might be legitimate reasons why you might not always be able to accommodate every request. So sometimes reviewers are wrong. You should be careful. You should be careful before adopting that view. Disagreeing you doesn't necessarily mean that a reviewer is wrong. But reviewers sometimes miss something in a paper, or that can happen. Or more commonly, or perhaps as commonly, the reviews might provide conflicting requests for improvement. And in those cases, the editor or associate editor might help you by providing their take on what you can do. And oftentimes an associate editor will say in the review which direction you might consider going, but oftentimes you'll have to chart your own path. Sometimes it's appropriate to come back to the associate editor with a request as to how that can be handled, so you could consider that. So responding to the reviews, whenever you resubmit your paper, it needs to be, at any stage, it needs to be accompanied by a document which thanks the reviewers and editors for their time and insights, and describes in detail how the reviewers' concerns were addressed, describes other significant changes to the paper, and states which criticisms were not accommodated and why. So what tends to happen often nowadays, and there are advantages and disadvantages to this, is that authors will often simply copy the response letter and reviews and insert their remarks as they go along. This can often be very helpful, but it can also produce unnecessarily long response documents. So, you know, there might be a way in which you can summarize at the beginning of your response letter the major changes that you've made, and then judiciously copy the portions of the response letters and reviews and intersperse your comments. You wouldn't want to copy every comment about every typo you ever had and then say done, 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 done. So be sensible about it, but there are different ways to do this. So make sure, some journals apparently do want authors to follow this format of copying the response letter and inserting and reviews and inserting their comments. So if there are guidelines that speak to this, then it would be important to just check that. In your response letter, tone is very important. Again, when your work is being criticized, it's, you know, possibly easy to be defensive, and I'll confess to having adopted that tone on occasion. Not recently, certainly not since being an editor, but it's never a good idea. And you know, the most professional and the most productive for you path really is to be measured, be polite, and not be defensive in your letter. Creates the best impression and will get you further. So, what to expect the second time around when you resubmit your manuscript? The editors will decide how to assess the changes and who should assess the changes. Whether the changes can be evaluated in-house, which saves you time, or whether another round of external review is needed. So if the decision was revise and resubmit, which indicates major revisions, then the paper will certainly be sent back to the original reviewers. Or the editors might decide to obtain a fresh review or a new reviewer. If they felt that if new issues arise, see, this is what happens if you change your paper to such an extent that it seems like a different paper. There's the opportunity that the editors may feel that they need to go and look for an additional reviewer or two. Hopefully, if new reviewers are solicited, or even if the original reviewers, more than one of them, needs to see the paper again, it's possible that review might take nearly as long as for the original submission, although we try to avoid this. And the other, unfortunately, it's possible that if the paper comes back from the reviewers and the feeling is that it would require yet another round of major revision, it is possible that the paper could be rejected at that time. If the revisions that were requested were relatively minor, the chances are good that the associate editor or editors can assess the changes themselves, or that if the paper needs to be sent for external review, it might only be sent to one of the original people that saw it. In that case, the paper's review can be a lot quicker. It's quite usual for a paper to undergo a round of major revision and then a subsequent round of revision for minor tweaks, and then we might even send it back to you for a few more minor tweaks. But so this is, it's very usual for papers to undergo this kind of sequential revision and review and revision and review. So what not to do? I think I've already covered this point. Not to revise the paper to the extent that it's almost not recognizable as the same paper. Adopt a defensive tone in the response letter. Use the response letter to complain that the reviewers were wrong instead of following their advice in the revision. There's actually a very good reason not to do that, in addition to which it just doesn't reflect well on you, and that is that sometimes these lengthy conversations as to the reviewers were wrong, here's why they were wrong, oftentimes it's really appropriate for these discussions to happen in print. So, you know, as part of the record for the paper. So, so that's another reason not to do this. Another thing that you should do is check the instructions that were in the editorial letter that you received initially to see how to resubmit the paper. You shouldn't send it to the editor by email or create a new online submission for the same paper, you would want to submit it in to the same online record that was created when you first submitted the paper. All right, now, finally, in the happy circumstances that your paper has been accepted, what can you expect? At this point, at language, at this point, you'd be asked to provide a pre-production draft of the paper formatted according to the journal's template. And this is a chance for last-minute fixes. In fact, once we can see that a paper is going to be accepted on the next round or is that close, we will even ask people to save time on the final round by formatting their paper in this way, so that it's ready once we are able to give them an accept decision. So some journals will assume that the version they last reviewed is definitive and send that version to production. So at some of the phonetics journals, for example, the manuscript, when you first submit the paper, you're already required to send tables and figures separately in separate files, so and so on, and format the paper as they would expect a pre-production draft to be formatted. And so in those cases, once your paper is accepted, you don't have that last chance. They simply forward what they have to the production department, and then what you see next is the proofs. So so the time that it takes in production really depends on the journal. Some journals have a staff of production people and are quite quick, and other journals which might have only one person, one copy editor, take longer, and it might be some months before they might have a backlog of papers in production, and it might take some months to hear from them. And so these things can vary. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. But after a period of time, you will receive a request to read and amend proofs and answer some formatting questions that the copy editor has, and supply additional information. For example, if some references were missing in your paper. And normally, nowadays, this step is typically done online, and that it's nearly always the case that you'll be asked to complete the requested steps in a matter of a very few days. So you can understand that at this point, that the copy editor has the paper. This is not the opportunity to make major changes. You can correct typos. You can even sneak in a few brief phrasings if you need to, but it's not the opportunity to make major changes, and some journals will charge you for excessive edits. So the lag time between the proof stage and the publication stage and print will vary as well. Many print journals nowadays, including language, including Journal of Phonetics, lots of journals do this. They will sort of pre-publish papers online before they appear in print, and they may send you a link that you can send that you can put on your academia.com site or whatever you're using. So that's all I have for you for this, and I think that it's time to do the next thing. If we can let David and Andries come back.
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, and hello again, everybody. So we're now at the question and answer portion of the webinar. If you have a question, go ahead and submit it using the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So when we have a question already, so you can, Andries and Megan, you can answer whichever one of you would like to. So here we go. Sorry. Why do some journals charge for publication? Is it hard/very competitive to publish in a good journal for free?
Well, journals charge for publication because it costs money to publish. Much of the work that is being done behind the scenes in publication is free labor. So at most journals, sorry, that's my phone ringing. At most journals, the editor and the editorial team works for free, right? But that takes a lot of time that goes into that. But typically the production staff, so the people who are doing the copy editing, those are professionals whose job it is to do that, and they need to be paid. It costs money to have an online presence for the journal. So all of those things cost money, and therefore some journals will charge to publish. Other journals don't. At Language, we typically don't. And the income that we generate at Language comes from subscriptions by members of the LSA or libraries to the journal, so the costs are covered not by the authors but by the readers. But somebody's going to have to cover the cost, whether it be the authors, the readers, or some outside foundation that wants to cover it. So journals charge because it costs money to publish a high quality journal.
Okay, thanks. Another question here. Where does Ling Buzz fit into the journal submission process?
Where does what, Ling Buzz?
Do you know Ling Buzz, Megan?
Oh, this is one of those sites where you can where you can put your paper. Well, we often receive submissions that were posted first on Ling Buzz, and just be aware that it's great to pre-publicize our work, but it can also out you as an author in case you want to submit your work to a journal later. It's possible that people who receive the paper to review will know who you are. So if it's important to you to have an anonymous review, and it's not important to everybody, but if it's important to you, then maybe think about where you post your paper before you submit it formally for consideration.
But usually that is not going to exclude the paper from consideration because Ling Buzz is not peer-reviewed.
Right.
So most journals will still be willing to consider it. However, check the journal's policies. Some may not. Right. So make sure that you check that.
Okay. And here's a question. What do you mean by charging for excessive edits?
Oh, well, so for example, I don't know what Language does actually, because but for example, some of the journals that I publish in, there are various things that they might charge for. If you want to have color in your charts in print, the journal would charge for that. Although they would have your graphs with color in them would appear for free online. I've never been charged for excessive edits. I've just been threatened with this. The idea being that if you ask for too many corrections at the proof stage, they might charge you. If you want to add whole new paragraph, I'm not sure. Has this ever happened to you, Andries?
It has never happened to me, but I have seen it happen at Language with some of our authors. So you get many opportunities along the way to make corrections. And even when the paper goes into copy editing, so it goes to our copy editing department, if there's questions along the way, the copy editor will ask you, and you can still make corrections at that stage. Once it leaves the copy editor and goes to the publishers, and they do the typesetting, beyond that point, every change that is made, the LSA is charged for. So beyond that point is, if there is some error that was introduced during the formatting, the typesetting, certainly that would be corrected at no charge. But if you beyond that point find more typos in the paper that you didn't pick up earlier, or you want to change phrasing or replace a new graph, that's going to be charged to the journal, and if that becomes too much, it will be charged to the author. We don't charge for every single change that happens at that stage because we all are humans and we can never have a perfect paper. There's always a few things that still slip in. But if it becomes excessive, then the cost has to be covered by somebody.
Two other things to say about this would be that some journals with a very strict length limit, like the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, for example, if you go over their length limit, I think that their guidelines say that they will charge you for the extra page. And for journals that are open access journals, or even for a journal like the Journal of Phonetics, if you want your paper to appear immediately and be accessible to everybody, you can pay an author's fee of, I'm not sure what it is, perhaps $300–400, and have, or whatever it is, and have the paper be available open access immediately, as opposed to waiting for whatever the period of time is after which the paper becomes accessible to everybody.
So at Journal of Phonetics, it's just over $1,000, the open access fee. We just paid it for a paper that we published.
That's a lot of money.
And I think after 5 years, it becomes open access. At Language, everything becomes open access after 1 year, but you can circumvent that 1 year embargo period by paying a $400 fee, and then your paper is open access from the moment of publication.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's another question. Can I publish a draft of my paper on my web page during the review process at the journal?
Megan, you take this.
I don't think we have a policy on that. In fact, even after papers are accepted, I think there's a period of time during which authors are allowed to have the papers on their on whatever page that they have. Just be aware that if you want your paper to be reviewed anonymously, think about wherever you post it might have implications for that. But people put their papers on their websites until the point that they're formally published, in which case they can't be for a while necessarily.
I agree.
Okay, and here's a question for Andries about publishing material from a dissertation or thesis. If you adapt material from your dissertation for an article, would the journal be concerned if the dissertation is available for reading online from the university? Would you consider it a prior publication?
No, generally not, because dissertations are such a different genre than journal articles that you would have had to do quite a bit of reworking of, say, a chapter from your dissertation to make it into a journal article. So it's going to be different in scope, different in focus anyway. But even if the differences aren't that great, there's generally no problem with that. Of course, if you converted your journal into a book and it was published as a book, that's more of an issue. But just your dissertation being available on your website or your institution's repository, that's not a problem.
But I think it's interesting, Lee, that what you just said, Andries, that you cannot take some, if you publish your dissertation as a book, then you can't take things out of that and publish it as a journal article. But it is apparently acceptable for an author to take their work that they've published in journals and then turn it into a book later on. You can use it, in that format later on, but it doesn't go the other way. Yeah.
But even if you want to take your journal articles and put them together later in a book, you have to make sure you follow the rules of the journal, the copyright agreement that you've signed, right? So don't violate the agreements.
Okay, and here's an interesting question. Do journals treat submissions from people who are unaffiliated with a research or academic institution differently from those who are affiliated? For instance, if someone leaves academia but would like to publish research conducted earlier in their career.
No, definitely not. I mean, we don't get many such papers, but I mean, that's one good reason why the review process is anonymous. So the reviewers shouldn't know, and if they happen to know, shouldn't take that into consideration.
The only affiliation requirement is that at the point that the paper is published, one of the authors of the paper needs to be a dues-paying member of the LSA at the point that the paper is published. But you don't have to be affiliated with any institution or university, and you don't have to be a dues-paying member of the LSA in order to submit a paper for publication to Language.
Okay, we're coming up to 2:30, but I know we ran a little bit over on the main portion of the program. So Megan and Andries, if you're available for another 15 minutes or so.
Sure.
Okay, then please, everybody, hang around as long as you can, and we'll go through some more questions. So here's a question. If a journal doesn't explicitly provide a way to suggest reviewers, where can I do that?
So if the journal doesn't provide an explicit like text box where you can enter that information, you know, in the cover letter that you submit with your submission, often there's a place where you can leave notes for the editor in the notes for the editor box. If none of those are available, an email to the editorial office, all of those are options that you can use.
Okay. Here's a question. Could you elaborate more on the differences in style, standard, and expectations between graduate student papers and professional published articles?
Well, since that was my part of the presentation, I guess that's my responsibility. That's a difficult one, right? It's kind of a less tangible, more intangible difference between the two. Definitely a difference in quality, right? So term papers tend to be something that, you know, if you're in a 13-week semester and you have to finish a term paper at the end of that semester, you probably don't start working on it until you are at work week 9 or 10 in all sincerity and all seriousness. So you won't have reviewed the literature in as much details. You wouldn't necessarily be as familiar with the field of research. It might be more a kind of proof of concept type document rather than a fully finished, completed research project, which is what would be expected from a journal article. So a really, really good term paper, I think a better way to think about it in terms of journal publication is now you have something that's similar to, say, a prospectus for a dissertation, a good plan for a research project that might turn into a journal article. But to make it into a journal article, it will have to be much more polished, cover all the bases, consider all the alternatives, much more polished writing. I don't think I'm answering this very clearly, but it is not a, there's 3 boxes, tick them, and now it's a good journal article. It's a more general quality judgment. I don't know if you have a better way of answering that, Megan.
I have a suggestion to make. I mean, this is what I tell students is that writing gets better with practice. This is writing in an academic style, in a journal style, is really an acquired skill. And the best advice I can give is read, but not only read the papers that you appear in the journals that you might aspire to publish in, but actively compare your writing style to the writing style of the papers you're reading. So so look to see what authors do, how they write, and aim to see if you can develop a composite style that incorporates the characteristics of the things that you're reading. So be very analytical about how you try and make your writing conform to the polished style that you're seeing in the papers that you read.
So a term paper is typically your first draft because you have a couple of weeks, a few weeks in which to write that. Before you submit something to a journal, it's not your first draft. It's, you know, even before you've gotten reviews on it, you should have revised it yourself many times, get feedback from colleagues and co-authors and mentors, and so it's just a much more polished piece of writing than even a typically very good journal term paper. You will do more revision and rewriting in a journal article than in any other writing you would have done in your career before you submit it, and certainly after you submit it and get revisions back. That the types of revisions that are usually required for journal articles is much more extensive than what you would, for instance, have to do on a dissertation after you've successfully defended it. Because the requirement is really for this to be the most polished piece of research that is possible. That's the standard at which journal articles are evaluated, which is a different standard for term papers or even for dissertations.
Okay, here's another question. A few years ago, I published a paper in a smaller French language journal and would like to get some deeper feedback, as this was an invited paper, as well as translated to English for it to reach a larger audience. What's the way to go about this ethically? E.g., how much updating/revision and how transparent to be about this?
It's a difficult one to answer. And what I'm saying now, I might change my view on after I've done more thinking and had an opportunity. Let's imagine somebody contacted Language and asked that question. So I will now say what my initial reaction is, but that might change once I've had time to consult with the rest of the editorial team. I think just a translation from the French into English is probably not going to be sufficient. You know, we don't publish translations of articles published elsewhere. We publish new original research. So if you can take that paper and expand upon it, take the analysis in a different direction, expand, make it a more comprehensive analysis, that might be acceptable. So then it becomes more similar to something that you published in, say, the Proceedings of the Berkeley Linguistic Society, and you take that paper and revise it and augment it and expand upon it so that it is not just another version of the same paper, but a different paper, even if related to an earlier publication. Whatever you do in a case like that, this would be something that you would discuss with the editorial team, the editorial office beforehand. So before you submit, reach out to the editor, explain the situation, give a copy of the original manuscript, the one you want to submit, explain how they're related to each other, how they're different from each other, to make it easy for the editorial team to evaluate the paper for appropriateness. You don't want this to come out after the fact. That will be bad. So talk to the editor beforehand.
Okay. Let's see. What is an average amount of time that it takes between finishing a PhD dissertation and publishing that work as a book?
In a book?
I don't know. I'm not in the book field. I've never had to publish a book.
Some people submit their dissertations or a lightly revised version of their dissertations to various, publishing houses. It used to be Garland. I'm not sure what there is anymore.
But I would assume that you can't just, well, the series that I think Megan is talking about was this Outstanding Dissertations in Linguistics series. That I don't think that exists anymore. And those were just basically publishing dissertations. Typically, you would have to, again, revise the dissertation into a book, because in the same way that dissertations aren't the same as journal articles, dissertations aren't the same as monographs. It's a different genre. So there will be some revision involved that I'm assuming can take months to years to do. But I'm flying in the dark here because linguistics, and specifically phonetic phonology where I work, is not a book discipline, so I don't have experience with monograph publication.
Okay. How many articles should a young scholar, e.g. 1 year after dissertation defense, aim to submit per year?
As many as possible.
As many as possible of good quality.
Of good quality. That's not really something that's easy to answer. Your target is going to really depend on and be affected by the kind of job that you're going to have and what the expectations are for tenure or for promotion of the institution that you've been hired. Some people are lucky enough to be postdoctoral fellows for a couple of years after the dissertation, which could be a gift of time, and publish as many papers as you can. But after that, people who are hired to teach 4 classes a semester versus people who are hired to teach 2 classes a semester, people in these situations have very different goals and really very different demands on their time, and different things that are possible. I'm not sure if the question was really about how many papers are required for tenure. So in other words, how many I should be publishing in order to be tenurable at my institution. And but these same factors that I'm mentioning are things that would bear on that issue, and it's hard to find a one-size-fits-all answer for that question. But I think most institutions where we teach 2 courses a semester, they expect to see at least 1 paper, maybe more than 1 paper accepted a year in order to be on track for tenure.
That sounds about right.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Andries.
No, I was just saying that sounds about right what Megan said.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. What if everyone in the field knows that I work on topic X? How can I then assure anonymity in my manuscript?
Well, then you cannot. In a field as small as linguistics, chances are that at least one, if not all, reviewers will be able to guess your identity. You give a talk about your research at a conference, people know your advisor and they know what your dissertation research is on. So chances are that reviewers might guess your identity. Even so, I think doing the review process anonymous is good. Even if there's a strong suspicion from the reviewers as to your identity, if they don't officially know, it places a certain amount of impersonalness, of objectivity, of distance in the review process, and I think it still creates for more professional reviews. But yeah, we have to acknowledge the fact that often it is not really possible to fully anonymize, to fully hide your identity. As if you're asked to review a paper, you might sometimes imagine that you know the identity of the author, and sometimes you might actually know. I would suggest, if you suspect you know the identity of the author, resist the urge to go onto Google and type the title of the paper into Google and see if you can confirm the identity of the author. So try to maintain that anonymity to the extent possible, all the while acknowledging that it might not be possible to do so completely.
Okay. Let's see. Can you give examples of topics that fall within the scope of the journal language?
Topics that fall within the scope. Well, as our statement says on our webpage, we publish papers that deal with linguistic theory, and then also language and public policy and teaching linguistics. So language and public policy and teaching linguistics are 2 online sections of the journal, and I think the title of those online sections make it clear what they would publish. In the main journal, we say linguistic theory, and that is both specific and general, right? So it's specific in the sense that we have a theory in there, meaning that a language paper would need to make a theoretical contribution that has to be thoroughly grounded in empirical data, but it crucially needs to make a theoretical distribution. It's not very specific in the sense that we don't specify what we mean by theoretical. So it could be from any of the subdisciplines, you know, syntax, semantics, conversation analysis, sociolinguistics, sentence processing, language acquisition, any of the subdisciplines is okay. And we also don't specify specific theoretical orientation. You know, so we, as a generalist journal, publish anything from minimalist syntax to usage-based approaches or functionalist approaches to linguistic theory. The important thing is that you engaged meaningfully with all the relevant literature, even if it comes from a theoretical orientation that is not the one you adopt in your paper, because we are a generalist journal, so we will have readers coming from all the various different approaches to your sub-area, and you have to engage with those various different approaches. So that's kind of the general view of what we are looking for. We're also at Language, because we're a generalist journal, looking for topics that will be of general interest. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't write a paper about a very specific technical aspect in the syntax of some language. You can certainly do that, but your paper has to be positioned such that the general readership of language would understand why it's interesting, why it's important, what's the main points that you're making, how this connects to linguistics with a capital L, more broadly speaking. If you're writing for a very specific technical specialized journal, that general broad setting might not be required. So you might have the same center part for a paper you send to Language or to a more specialist journal, but the surrounding text, the introduction, the positioning of the paper might be different between the two venues where you might consider submitting. Megan, do you have words of wisdom, or does that sound about right?
That's great. So what I would add to that, so because we're a generalist journal, this means that we have phonologists and syntacticians reading. So if you are submitting a syntax submission, for example, we would not necessarily ask you to make everything absolutely clear to a phonologist, but we would want a syntactician of any stripe to be able to read the paper, understand the point that's being made, and you know, to have the point be appeal to syntacticians across these subdisciplinary lines. So this is what we mean in a case like that. Now, some papers, for example, we do get a lot of papers on that would be in a particular area. I'm thinking of some pragmatics papers that have come in recently that really are fascinating to everybody, and which could be read by and enjoyed by people in multiple disciplines, not just semanticists and syntacticians. And so, you know, when we talk about broad appeal and being accessible to everybody, it really depends on it depends to some extent on what type of paper it is. And everything else that Andries has said, I mean, what he said is absolutely right.
So I think we want at Language papers that make bigger statements. So if you have a very cool, small discovery, small contribution to make, that might fit more appropriately in a specialist journal. And a Language paper is typically a slightly bigger, more substantive contribution. Although, as I was saying that, I reminded myself of the fact that we do have an online section called Research Reports at Language, which is specifically aimed, if you read the information about it on our website, it's specifically aimed at these smaller, more specialized contributions. And we explicitly say those papers do not necessarily have to be accessible to a broader audience or appeal to a broader audience. They can be a more focused, more technical, smaller contribution. Something like a squib. So there is that option also at Language. One last thing, right? So Language is the journal of the Linguistic Society of America. So one way that I think about it is, if research can be presented at the annual meeting of the Linguistic Society, that's probably appropriate for the journal. So we have a broad view. We want to represent the Linguistic Society of America. So the research done by the society is probably appropriate for the journal, with a few notable exceptions. As Megan mentioned, we don't publish papers on the second language teaching. We publish papers on bilingualism and, say, second language acquisition, but not second language teaching. So there are a few exceptions.
Okay, and then maybe time for one last question before we wrap up. What recommendations do you have on deciding between submitting a manuscript as a squib or a short paper versus as a full-sized paper?
Well, I'll take that one, since the squib or reports at Language falls under my purview, so I'm primarily responsible for them. So it depends on the content of your paper, right? So the general research papers are the ones that appear in the print version of the journal and that are assumed to have the broad generalist appeal, so that even if not every reader will understand every detail, readers should generally understand why this is interesting and important research. They also have to make bigger contributions, more substantive theoretical contributions. They can also be longer. As Megan mentioned, we have an upper limit of 18,000 words for research papers, so it gives you more space to develop your argumentation. The research reports, which is the language version of squibs, have a much shorter length limit. I think we limit that to 9,000 words, so it's half the length of a full paper. So if you need more words than that to make your case, then the research report's not going to be appropriate. But then those also they are allowed to be very technical, to be accessible primarily to specialists in your area, so they don't have to have that broad appeal, broad accessibility of a general research paper. They can also make a smaller theoretical contribution, right? So they might make a small single contribution rather than address the theory more broadly. So it's going to depend on the exact nature of your paper. The research report squib section, time to decision is usually faster because they are shorter papers, and sometimes they are reviewed by members of the editorial team only, and they don't necessarily always go out for external review. They're still reviewed, so it's still a reviewed publication. So that's another consideration, is time to decision. Those are often shorter at the research reports. But the most important thing, I think, is the nature of the paper, right? Mm-hmm. Does it fit the requirements for the main research section or for the research report? There are different kinds of papers. They can both be good, but a good research report might not be a good general research article, or vice versa.
As a practical way to decide, for those of you who do experimental research, for example, a paper in phonetics, a main article in phonetics, the rule of thumb is that you would need at least 2 experiments, or at least one big experiment that is the equivalent of 2 experiments. So, for example, you do the same experiment with different language groups. But sometimes you have a study that you've done, and it's a good little study, and it makes a point, and it doesn't have a second experiment. What do you do with that study? It doesn't need another experiment to make the point that it's making. Well, you can write that up as a shorter paper and submit it as a squib or as an express letter or something like that to one of the journals. So there might be that practical consideration for you as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're about out of time. So many thanks to all of you who attended the webinar. We will have a recording available later, and we'll send you a link to it once it has been uploaded to the LSA's YouTube channel. Special thanks again to Megan Crowhurst and Andries Coetzee for sharing their experience and expertise with us. And I hope this webinar has succeeded in making the process of journal publishing more transparent. Thanks again, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.